We are very excited to have you all with us today for our data deep dive for the Success Network Policy Committee. We've pulled together a lot of interesting data metrics today, and we're excited to kind of go through it all with you and see what kind of interesting insights and conversations we can have and pull from it. So I will get us started just with a little bit of an intro. So here are some of the things that we're going to do today. So we are going to start with welcome and introductions, and then we are going to set the stage for the data review with just some kind of introductory framing. And then we're going to review some measures that we've picked out, both secondary and post-secondary. And then we're going to wrap up with a few final questions, and then some next step and reminders for the policy committee. So with that, we're gonna do some welcome and introductions. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Monagudo, and I am a policy and program manager with Ed Systems. I am one of the facilitators of the policy committee, along with my colleague Emily, who I will introduce herself. And then we also have with us today Mamusi from the Ed Systems team. So I guess I will hand off to the two of you so you can both introduce yourselves. So let's start with Mamusi.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Mamusi Ntore. I work at Education Systems Center as a data analyst. So I work a lot with the Illinois report card data and helping to analyze and build dashboards for communities around Illinois. So happy to be with you all today.
Hi, everyone. Emily Ruska. I'm Managing Director of Policy and Programs at Ed Systems. And Laura, maybe for folks who might be newer to the policy committee or just found out about this amazing opportunity to talk about data, would you mind just giving a smidge of background on the policy committee just to help folks get themselves situated? And for those of you who are on the line, please do add your name and organization to the chat so we can get a sense of who's in the room here.
Yes, thank you. So some background on the policy committee is a great idea. So we started the Success Network Policy Committee in December of 2022, which is weird. I just had a moment where I can't say last December anymore, and that weirded me out. But we just started it in December of 2022 because we saw that there was kind of a need to bring statewide folks together, practitioners, policymakers, folks from the nonprofit space, kind of all of these different people together to have an opportunity to both discuss potential policy changes at the, P20 pipeline spectrum, but also to explore promising practices, bring people together to kind of hear what each other are doing in a way where potentially they're able to inform policy, both at the district and local level and across the state. So one of the things that has been a part of the policy committee's practice over the last year or so is doing a couple times a year where we go deeper into some data and kind of see what questions, what insights we can gain from it, and what potential policy impact it can have. So that's why we have you all here today. I already talked about some of the things we're going to cover. We have a couple questions that we're going to kind of talk about before I hand off to Emily to get us started, just to gauge kind of where people are with how they engage with data. So if you would be interested in sharing, we would love for folks to put I'll give you, a couple extra words if you need 3, but 1 to 3 words to describe how you engage with data in your role currently. So I'll give you all a second to just kind of drop in the chat how you would describe your interactions with data as is right now in your role. Ooh, Sam, I like that. Data-informed decision maker. People say performance measures, informing student intervention, and communications about data. I feel lots of interesting different ways that people are using data. Surfacing equity implications, policy and practice, accountability, district evaluation and planning, informing advocacy. I feel like we've got a really wide range of things that are coming out So this makes me excited about all the people we have here today. Targeted outreach, that's another really good one. That's one of the ways that I like to use data. Awesome. So we have one more question. Yes, Emily is right. Keep adding your thoughts. One more question with you before I hand it off to her. What data resources do you find yourself turning to when you are looking at data? So it could be things like the Illinois school report card. It could be some data you have at your district or local level. The Success Network dashboard is a great tool. iPads. Internal data from college. I love the Success Network dashboard. I'm really excited, and I know this is not yet here, but Mamusi is doing some really cool work with the dashboard. And I'm excited to see where it's going very soon. Internal surveys, school report card, Georgetown University Center. All right, lots of stuff. I feel like some stuff that we kind of looked at when we were putting this together today. So lots of different places that we turn to when we're looking for data. So I think one of the things that makes that interesting is it's kind of sometimes hard to like really gain from all of those different things. Like, what are some of the commonalities? What are some of the themes? What are some of the questions that we can ask? So that's kind of, again, one of the goals of pulling it all together in different places. Qualitative data. Yes, I love qualitative data. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily to kind of get us ready for our data conversation before we dive into all the numbers.
Thanks, Laura. So yeah, I'm here to just sort of say, why are we reviewing these data together? And so we can go to the next slide. We think about, when we at Ed Systems and Success Network think about data, we think about it in terms of kind of a primary way of like as a lens, right? And that's both as a window lens looking out to develop into insights as to what's happening in the field or in our districts or in our community, really getting a grip on what's going on out there, as well as a mirror, right? So what we're seeing happening in terms of access and outcomes reflects the systems that are producing those outcomes, right? And the people who are experiencing those systems and navigating those systems and why they're having the outcomes that they are. So it serves as a mirror as well for us to be able to reflect in a continuous improvement process about what that says about our practices, our systems, our policies, and thus can help us identify where we might want to make some shifts. It also helps us engage our equity lens. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. You know, I like to center this quote or this sort of framing around any system produces what it was designed to produce. A little bit of a tongue twister for me today. The National Equity Project is an organization that does a lot of great work on equity and education. And, you know, just thinking about, again, the ways that the outcomes that we see are reflective of the systems that we have put in place and the ways in which people experience those systems. I also like this visual on the bottom left in terms of comparing the difference between equality and equity, right? Equality would mean assuming that everyone needs the same type of bike, when in fact, based on size, ability, and any number of factors, folks need different resources or a different type of bike in order to get them from point A to point B. And so too, do we need to think about the ways in which our P20 systems, our education and workforce and employment systems are helping folks get from point A to point B, while honoring their differences and meeting their needs and meeting them where they're at. So as we move forward to the next slide, you know, just liking to frame this up as why do we engage with data again, right? So what does examining data help us do? And really, it helps us focus on that student achievement. It helps us focus on that learner success in a number of environments. But there are a number of different components that fit into that, right? So understanding what kinds of data we have, what folks' skills or comfort level in engaging with data, having a culture of engaging with data from top to bottom and bottom to top in our systems and organizations, and then using those data on a regular basis to inform policy, to inform that practice and programs, et cetera, right? So if we do that in a student-centered way, if we engage qualitative data, Jessica, thanks for flagging that in the chat. You know, if we couple these things together and consider them deeply on a regular basis, that will help us drive improved achievement for young people throughout our state. And so, you know, one thing I'll just name before we get in, folks get hesitant about engaging with data for a number of reasons. I mean, y'all are a self-selecting crew, so I imagine that we've got a lot of eager data consumers here. Caitlin, I saw your comment in the chat earlier. And I think what's important for us to remember is that the data can be a tool for us, right? And it doesn't have to be a hammer. It doesn't have to be punitive. It can be helpful to illuminate challenges that are happening in the field, illuminate opportunities to improve the work that we're doing, and also illuminate our successes. And so I just want to challenge us all to think about that as we're going through. And so before I hand off to Mamusi to start introducing some of those secondary measures that we're going to look at today, I want to just encourage folks to, as we're going through the data, drop thoughts in the chat. What's surprising you? What is sticking out to you? What might some implications be? And that might be, the implication might be, we need to look at this in a different way. We need to look at a slightly different cut of these data. An implication could be, there needs to be better information about XYZ component. And so feel free to continuously drop those in the chat, and we'll pause kind of throughout to take questions. So feel free to also use the raise hand function if you've got a specific question or a comment that we can address. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on the hand raising, and we'll work our way through in that way. So with that, I'd love for us to dive in, and I'll hand it over to Mamusi to walk us through a good chunk of the secondary data we've got here.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So yeah, as Emily said, we want to present you all with a few of the key indicator metrics for secondary success, especially with the release of the latest report card in October. And so we can start with ninth grade on track. And again, with the new release of report card data, it's great that we have another year to analyze trends and see what's going on with students in our schools. And especially looking at ninth grade on track, we see that in that, in that COVID year, that dip of percentage of students across the board, even in the these key main demographics. But one thing that's at least a positive outlook on this is that rebound that we've seen in the years since, in many cases, and even in particular for Black students, that rebound has taken them even higher than that COVID year. And so I think it's telling the story of progress, which I think you'll start to notice as we look at more metrics here. You can go to the next slide. Next, we have early college coursework, which is defined as students taking any AP, dual credit, or even IB classes. But most of the number of students enrolling in early college coursework is made up of AP and dual credit, with a large majority of students taking AP classes. But as you can see with that purple line, dual credit coursework is on the rise as AP coursework kind of remains steady. So in the years to come, we may see dual credit and AP get closer in the number of students taking those level of classes. But overall, just a rise over the last 6 years of students taking these types of early college classes.
Mamusi, just a point of clarification of the counts here. That's across all grades, correct?
Correct. That is across all high school grades 9 through 12. Yes. And similarly, on the next slide, you'll see just the rates, the percentage of high school students that are taking these classes, very similar to the counts of students overall is rising since 2017, 2018 to this past school year. And most of that rise seems to be driven by dual credit participation. We've had just an increasing number of students each year participating in dual credit coursework. And then diving into dual credit coursework by different race groups, in particular, white students, Black students, and Hispanic students, we see that there's still a lag between Black and Latinx students compared to white students taking dual credit, but there is a rise. We are seeing that rise, and across the board, again, more students are taking those classes. And when we look kind of what's the percent change from year to year going through, you can see that dip in school year 20, I believe it's 2021 to 2022, but again, a recovery in that year, especially with the Latinx Hispanic students that rebounded and really recovered from that dip in 21, 22. So overall, I think we're seeing a positive trend when it comes to what students are doing in schools and how they're accessing these early college classes.
And just want to pause here just for a second around why we're using counts versus percentages when we're looking at it from a demographic lens. And that's, Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong, that's just because the demographic data from these two indicators, the way that it lines up wouldn't be as precise of a percentage measure in terms of participation percentage, right?
Correct. Given the current reporting structure of the report card, we don't have fully accurate counts of high school students by demographic. So it would be a pretty rough estimation.
Right. So that's part of why we wanted to reflect the percentage change in dual enrollment and to look at that over time to see sort of how that year over year changes. And certainly there's some interesting jumps and there are some interesting dips, and definitely welcome folks either speaking up or dropping thoughts in the chat about how you see this showing up in your community, if there are any surprises, what questions it might prompt for you, et cetera.
And then moving on to statewide CTE participation. And thankfully, in the last 2 years, the report card has started to reflect more robust CTE data. Previously, from going back from school year 2017-18 up to 2020-2021, what was reported was just a number of students taking CTE. But starting in 2022 and then onward, even in this last version of the report card, we actually have a lot more robust data on CTE, like what we see here, which is showing the percentage of students that are classified CTE participants, meaning that they've enrolled in at least one CTE course during the school year, or CTE concentrators, which are students that are defined as passing 2 or more distinct CTE courses in their high school career. And not only that, and hopefully to come soon in the dashboard, we can also look at programmatic data for students in terms of like what types of CTE classes are students taking, what's the demographic makeup of those classes, and what are some of the post program outcomes for these kids, like graduation rates, post-program placements, work-based learning, what type of experiences are students having as they're going through CTE programs. And so that's an exciting thing that I'm hoping will continue to be included in the data for CTE, that we can really speak more to the experience of students in these classes.
Before we move on, I want to make sure we've got a question in the chat. Are concentrators taking 2+ courses in the same CTE pathway, or could they be taking 2 different ones? I believe the latter could be the case.
It could be the case. Yeah, it's not as far as I've seen on the report card website. It doesn't give that distinction of which, if they're in the same program or not. So I don't have an answer to that. But that's a great question. And so what you're seeing here is just the statewide first of percentage of students participating from one year to the next, but then also in success network districts, which are specifically defined as communities throughout the state of Illinois that are engaging in a collective effort, a coalition of the willing for shared resources, shared engagements, not only with ed systems, but also with within the networks, within each other. So that's that comparison that you're seeing there.
I'm so sorry. If we could go back to the CTE page. I think, Cassie, I see your comment in the chat. These terms are coming directly from the report card. I definitely tend to agree that if we're saying concentrating in CTE, I think it would be a safe assumption to be that CTE would mean that in a specific CTE pathway. So we can follow up with the report card team to get a better understanding of if and how it might be possible to get some clarity on that one.
Mamusi, my apologies. I think I skipped a slide. So I don't know. I think this slide with the side-by-sides of Success Network, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I think I skipped it to the comparison slide accidentally.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, it's generally the same comparison. So we had statewide looking at from one school year to the next, and this is just looking specifically at districts and schools that are engaged with the Success Network and their CTE data, which we can see, I think, for both statewide as well as Success Network districts, an increase both in the number of students as well as the percentage of students engaging in CTE coursework.
All right. I think this is where I take the baton from Mamusi. So some other measures that we are looking at. So we have the college and career pathway endorsement, specifically endorsement earners. So students receiving the endorsement. In the bar graph, you can see we have quite a bit of increase over the last few years as the college and career pathway endorsement is scaling throughout the state. That kind of aligns with, you know, the conversations that we're seeing, some of the policy that's come up. So awesome to see the earners scaling. I think that's one place where, you know, Emily mentioned the idea of having the flashlight pointed on some wins. But something that's interesting to look at kind of alongside of that is a demographic breakdown. So this is the class of 2023, and just a breakdown of the earners. So you can see there is still a little bit of a gap with majority of the students in that class of 2023 that completed the college and career pathway endorsement and earned it, being primarily white students. So there is a little bit of a demographic gap that I think, you know, raises some interesting questions. So that is, you know, I think something that's nice to look at alongside to kind of, again, get the bigger picture and really to kind of ponder as we're talking about all the different work with college and career pathway endorsements that's going on in the state right now. Another thing that has sort of come with this year's new report card data is some interesting information and kind of highlights. So this right here is just kind of a screenshot of the main page, but they have a lot of different components of the college and career readiness indicator available for the first time through the school report card. So in the deck, which we will share, there's a link specifically to where you can look. I've highlighted a couple screen grabs on the next few slides that I just think are, you know, relevant to the conversations we're having today and some data that we wanted to put forth for you all. But when you go on the Illinois School Report Card site where you see snapshot, you can drop down and select different indicators. You can also sort of toggle different things like by demography or specifically low income students. So just kind of moving on, but if you are really interested in exploring some of these pieces, there's more other things that we did not put in this presentation on the report card site. One of the things that we did pull from the report card was the percentage of students. I see there is a question. Cassie, you have your hand raised.
It's about, yeah, go ahead, Cassie, jump in.
On that previous slide, Laura, I don't know if like the data on for the CCRI on things like summer employment, you know, there's a piece on there of if you're employed so much.
Right.
I would just warn people that some schools, that's self-reported by students. And so,
Yep.
you know, schools are I think technically supposed to be collecting pay stubs, and I'm just working the field, and I'm just going to tell you that a lot of it's self-reported. So
Sure.
I would look at it, some of it, you know, with a very cautious lens.
Yeah, Cassie, thank you for flagging that. That's as you'll recall, because we've dragged you through these conversations for years at this point, when the former College and Career Readiness Committee of the P20 Council was trying to help ISB develop the sub-indicators or sub-components of the College and Career Readiness Indicator. One of the stickiest parts was the conversation about how is this going to get collected, right? How are these data going to get collected? How are they going to be tracked? How do we ensure they're of quality? And not just for the sake of having quality data, but for the sake of having quality data so that we can know for a fact that these things are being accessed, that students are having success in doing them, and we can have a continuous improvement lens. So I definitely echo your caution around data quality. And so I would actually love to invite folks, as we look at some of these components, which, as Laura said, there's tons in there. The data quality are varied. And like GPA data is a sticky subject. That alone is a sticky subject, right? But so as we look at this, I would love if folks can share in the chat thoughts about how your district might be handling college and career readiness indicator data reporting, anything that you're seeing in terms of how this shows up in your district, whether in terms of like student participation in different things, et cetera. And so, you know, because I think part of the lens that we have is how can we be thought partners to ISB around like, how do we continuously improve the process for reporting this, right? So that we can make good on this indicator as an indicator of school quality and as a multiple measures approach to assessing that readiness. So thank you very much for that caution, Cassie. You know, it definitely doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it does mean take it all with a grain of salt. Let me see how many more metaphors I can bring in. But sorry, Laura, back to you.
No, thanks. I think that is a pretty important nuance to recognize with the CCRI data that we're going to go through that I hadn't really touched. So I appreciate the call out. So with that, like I said, we did pick a couple. So these are percentages of students earning the career ready indicators, which the career ready indicators are kind of some of the stickiest ones, but this is just overall percentages. So from students with 0 career ready indicators, through 1, 2, and then 3 plus. So you can see, you know, we have generally ranging from, you know, a little bit about 22% for 0, 1 indicator and 2 indicators, and then about 33% of students with 3 plus. And these are total percentage of total students. So this is just an overall snapshot. On the next slide, we have.
Wait, sorry, if we can go back to that slide so just as a reminder, the career ready indicator is that the expectation in achieving the college and career readiness indicator or having a student marked as college and career ready is that they meet a couple of thresholds around attendance, GPA. They have to meet a college ready indicator in math and English, both math and English. 1 indicator each, and there's multiple measures that can meet that. We looked at a couple of those in our meeting in December, and then they have to have at least 3 career ready indicators. And so the top left corner, ideally, in order for all students to be able to meet the CCRI, would be as high as possible. And so any of the kind of the right hand and then the bottom row indicates that students are not being, you know, are not reporting or are not being reported to have completed at least 3 career ready indicators. But as Cassie said, the reporting on that is a little bit funky. So like this is probably not fully representative of how many students have completed as many career ready indicators as possible. It's probably an undercount, but it still is very, I think, important for us to reflect on just in the overall kind of proportions here.
Yes, thank you for that added context. Now similarly, same metric. So again, a little bit squishy with the reporting, but basically that same metric of percentage of students earning career ready indicators, again, with the goal to be 3 or more, broken down by demography. So we can see here, when we look at the students who have 3 or more, the highest percentage is represented to be white students, with a little bit of a gap for Black and Hispanic students. And then when we look, you know, as it goes down to 2, 1, and then students who don't have any indicators, we are seeing those numbers kind of flip where the highest amount of student percentages that don't have those indicators are going to be Black and Hispanic students, with white students, you know, not having any indicators at a lower rate. So that I think highlights some interesting conversations just about, you know, how you know, how in an equity lens are we, you know, looking at and making sure that we are, you know, getting students to meet these indicators. So I think some interesting questions here. One last piece from the CCRI data that we pulled is percentage of students identifying a career interest by the end of sophomore year. So this is broken down by all the demographies, again, just captured from the report card. I think it's pretty interesting. It's pretty steady across the board, but again, a little bit lower for our Black and Hispanic students. So I think that highlights some interesting conversations. Again, white students, as well as Asian students, a little bit above the overall, but an interesting breakdown to take a look at. And then wrapping up our secondary measures, we have here our 4-year high school graduation rate. So you can see the overall is kind of a little bit of a jump and then a dip with the COVID, but it's pretty much, evened out or increased to where it was before that kind of COVID dip. We do see interestingly, we do see, a little bit of a decline with white students, and a little bit of an increase from that dip, with Black and Hispanic students. I think, unless there's any other context, Emily or Mamusi, you want to add, we are ready to move on to our, oh no, I have questions. I forgot about my questions. A few questions before we move on to our post-secondary metrics. So first question, is there anything that surprises you about the data that we have highlighted so far?
And feel free to either speak up or drop it in the chat.
I feel like the chat's been pretty active, so. No surprises.
Laura, I would say when I looked at the school report card data, not what was in this presentation, but the thing that jumped out at me the most was some of these very high chronic absenteeism rates. They're shockingly high in some of my schools, and their absences they're not truant, they're being excused. And it really affects students across the board, but in some of our CTE programs, it doesn't matter if your mom calls you out of school because your head hurts, like you have to fulfill the number of hours to get your BNAT license or your EMT basic. And those rules are set by agencies that, school district administrators or teachers don't have any control over. So these really high chronic absenteeism rates were pretty shocking to me.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point that it is a little different in the context of those CTE classes too. A couple comments in the chat about seeing some of the numbers level out to where they were before COVID, being interesting to see. And I do think that it's interesting, especially I feel like with a couple of the different metrics we're seeing that, and that's, I think kind of encouraging that hopefully things are going in the right direction. Another question, what challenges do these data surface? I know one that stands out to me that I think, we've had a little bit of conversation about it at Systems, relates to the college and career pathway endorsement earners. When you look at it by demography, we're seeing growth overall, but like I said, there are quite a bit of gaps when you look at it by demography. And I think that's definitely something that's prompting some conversations to see, what can we do at a system level to kind of help close those gaps? So that's something that stands out to me as potentially a challenge. I'm curious if there's anything for anyone else. Persistent gaps across racial categories. That's true. Oh, I almost got a little water down the wrong pipe. Changing mindsets. Can you expand a little bit about what you mean? Are you talking about in relation to dual credit enrollment? I think it was Linda. All right. I think I have one more question. What opportunities or wins do you see in the data. So I think one that somebody mentioned that I think fits with this question is just increasing dual credit enrollment. And dual credit continuing to grow across the state. Oh, changing mindsets after COVID. Narrowing gap for high school graduation. Awesome. Well, I think I will hand it off to Emily now for these post-secondary measures.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So first up, when we're looking at post-secondary measures, just sort of picking up the baton from graduation into that transition point. So we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Is post-secondary enrollment within 16 months. And so what this visual shows is enrollment in 4-year and 2-year institutions within 16 months of high school graduation. And so in the blue is the 4-year enrollment rates, in the orange is the 2-year enrollment rates. So, you know, similar to across the nation, there has been overall a decline in post-secondary enrollment. But I'll just note that the proportions are different for 4-year and 2-year. So there has been a greater percentage point drop in post-secondary enrollment at the 2-year level versus at the 4-year level in the post-secondary enrollment within 16 months. So I'll just flag that. And, you know, again, as we're going through, feel free to drop thoughts, reflections, surprises, insights in the chat. I think this also kind of fits into the, you know, Linda, I know that you were talking about sort of mindsets shifting after COVID. I think a lot of folks, both with COVID and other factors around affordability, et cetera, folks are making choices about post-secondary for a variety of reasons, right? And so that is reflected in Illinois, it's reflected across the nation. And so there's a number of factors that can be at play here. And if we go to the next slide about what happens when students are in our colleges and universities, we always like to reflect on the remediation data for a number of reasons, right? So for the fact that the numbers overall are going down in a very good way, and that is important, right? This means that more of our students, you know, in this case, this is community college remediation rates. It means that more of our students are arriving at those community colleges ready for credit-bearing math and English. And so what that means is that they are not as slowed down. It means that fewer students are potentially being stopped out at the post-secondary level, and that ultimately contributes to greater post-secondary success. Cassie, I see your comments in the chat. One thing just, and it goes back to the enrollment, it is interesting to see the proportion being higher, like the drop being higher, proportionally higher among 2-year enrollments, because also particularly in economic downturns, which COVID prompted, obviously, typically you see greater community college enrollment. So it's very interesting to see that has not held quite as much in this current era. Transitional math was required for implementation for, that's a good question. Edith, do you know off the top of your head the year that, or Laura, do you know the year off the top of your head that transitional math first had to roll out? I think it was for, I think it would be for, in terms of students who would have experienced it, I think it would have been at the class of 2019, or the class, you know, would have been reflecting that, or 2018 or 2019.
That sounds right.
Yeah, so the earliest students who would have experienced that would have been in that 18-19 timeframe. So we certainly attribute some of this drop to transitional math instruction. We also, you know, can attribute it to a number of different things. But very exciting to see remediation dropping overall. It was kind of interesting, you know, not entirely surprising to see an uptick in some cases between 2020 and 2021, just given what was happening, right? The class of 2020 had the bulk of their high school experience before COVID hit. The class of 2021, you know, 1.5 years of their schooling were deeply impacted by COVID. And so certainly that means that there is bound to be challenges around learning and readiness. And so just to pivot, we're, you know, last year we looked at some data from the college and career or community college research center around kind of post-secondary enrollment trends and all of that. This year, the Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce has a couple of really interesting reports. And so we're going to look at some data from two of them. One of them is this post-secondary attainment changes report that's about sort of changes in post-secondary attainment over time. Again, the deck and the recording will be shared out about all of this, so you'll have these links. And so the reason why we're going to take a look at this is a couple fold, right? Illinois has a state goal of 60% of Illinois residents, adults, having a quality post-secondary degree or credential by 2025. That's next year now. And the Success Network, for those of you who have been around a while, used to be called the Illinois 60 by 25 Network. Our core focus was this post-secondary attainment rate specifically. And we are still very driven by that, and also recognize that this work is not going to end next year, right? So that's why we made the shift to be the Education and Career Success Network. But this report helps us take a look at what's happening with attainment, both overall and in a disaggregated way. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, where we'll see the overall changes in attainment. And so these data are based on census data. Census data is limited when it comes to attainment rates. So, for example, in the light blue category, some people in that light blue category of some college have an industry credential or some other post-secondary credential that is sub-associate in nature, but that is not collected in our census. So therefore, it is not reflected in you're not able to disaggregate by that in a report such as this. But the overall message here is that associates and higher attainment in Illinois has risen since 2010, from 2010 to 2020. And overall, that means that a larger share of adults in our state have a post-secondary degree or credential. There have been gains sort of across all of those associates and higher categories of associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees. And then the research that Georgetown did, or the center did, indicates that we were at overall 20th in the nation around growth of associates or higher attainment, and 19th of bachelor's or higher attainment from 2010 to 2020. On the next slide, we've got changes in attainment gaps. And so, as many of you will recall, the state has had a lot of conversation around equity gaps in post-secondary attainment, right? It's one thing to achieve 60 by 25. In fact, the state is on track overall to reaching 60% by 2025, but that is not even across different demographic groups. So what you're seeing on this slide here is the vertical line towards the right here is in looking at white adult attainment, overall attainment, which is 55%. This is the associates or higher. So this is not inclusive of sub-associate credentials. So I'll just note that limitation. The percentage point gaps for these different demographic groups with in put next to overall white adult attainment. And so that's helping us get a little bit more under the hood of what's happening from an equity standpoint in terms of our outcomes, right? So the gap change in the first column is indicating how much that gap changed over time. So the gap widened between Black and white adults. The gap narrowed between Latino and white adults. And so, just wanting to put this up here as we think about what are the implications for different student populations that we're working with, and understanding what it means to prepare young people for college and career and life. So I'll pause there for a second before we move to the next slide, because I know we have a little bit of time. If there are any sort of reflections on these overall attainment changes. All right, we can move to the next slide. And, Georgetown does an interesting thing in their reports where they try to estimate lifetime earning impacts on attainment gaps. I mean, we know that folks who have quality post-secondary degrees and credentials earn more money over time, right? And that doesn't mean that it has to be a bachelor's necessarily. This visual represents associates and higher. Certainly, we have some assumptions about other kind of sub-associate but post-secondary credentials that have value in the workforce and how that can impact lifetime earnings. But essentially, the impact of educational access and success and equity gaps therein impacts long-term economic outcomes for different demographies, different demographic groups. It has real manifest impacts on people's lives and their ability to access resources, their ability to grow wealth. There's tons of reporting on all of this, but wanted to put this in front of folks. It's not necessarily something we always look at in our policy committee per se, because it can feel a little bit more abstract, but it just demonstrates some of the estimated real world consequences of these gaps. So tying to this, the Center for Education Workforce also kind of did a revamp of a report on what jobs are growing across the nation and in specific states, and what types of education and training do those jobs require. And so getting a projection of job demand, this new measure of job demand, that will indicate, okay, new jobs coming down the pipeline, what requirements will they have? And so kind of trying to think of future of work type stuff. So as we dive into this report, the first table we'll put up here is around just the overall share of jobs, the projected jobs coming in by 2031, and the share of them that require different levels of education. And so you'll notice that 9% or 21% will require some college, but no degree being no associates or bachelor's or higher. 9% associates, 25% bachelor's, 15% graduate. And so on the right-hand side, you see the sort of rank by share among states. So what that means is compared to the other 51 states, they count Washington, D.C. as a state for purposes of the report, where Illinois ranks in terms of that share of the jobs requiring that level of education. And so in this case, we are one of the states that has some of the highest rates of or shares of jobs requiring a graduate degree, being ranked number 9 there. We're closer to middle of the pack on some college and no degree, and closer to middle of the pack on associate's degree. And that's just by virtue of the types of jobs that are coming down the pipeline. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, go back to that slide, Laura, please. So in Illinois, 49% of jobs will require a 2-year degree or higher by 2031, but the goal is to have 60% have a 2-year degree or higher by 2025. So the 60 by 25 goal is based on degrees inclusive of sub-associate credentials, degrees and credentials. So that doesn't necessarily mean everyone will have a 2-year degree or higher. Lumina does a kind of back of the napkin, not back of the napkin. They do a calculation estimate of individuals that have industry credentials. But yeah, so we are in order. This is just new jobs. Sorry, to make clear, of new jobs, the share of jobs requiring those degree levels is that much. So it doesn't mean that jobs that already require that level of education, it doesn't mean that those no longer exist. Sorry, that's the key difference here. That's my apologies for the lack of clarity there. So when we look at this next slide here, we've got the kind of change in jobs by education level, and we've got the kind of rankings of these percentages of jobs. Again, that's from that right-hand column. And so, again, as we're increasing jobs that require middle skills, if we're increasing jobs that require bachelor's or higher, we're not increasing as much jobs that are requiring fewer than a high school diploma or less. And then when we look at by the next slide is just sort of by occupation type. I would take a little bit of issue with how they frame some of these occupation types, but this is what on the next page, Laura, this is just how they've framed them. There are, I think, some conversations that could be had about how these are framed, but this is estimated job growth in different types of fields. And they also, in the report, you can take a look. Well, again, we'll send all these reports and links out, but you can see sort of job requirements within each of these different areas as well in terms of the education requirements.
Emily, a quick question as we're looking through these slides. I can't help but think about the large percentage of new arrival families coming from Central and South America, and how the children that will have traveled with them or will be born through these families will impact these numbers as well, as since especially since we know like college requirements to access financial aid is really limiting for our undocumented students. So I'm just wondering if that was taken into account when looking at this, or if we will be looking at new data set in like 5 to 10 years.
That's a great question. I don't believe so. I would assume that it was these reports were produced by the Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce. I would assume that they were not necessarily taking into account the current dynamics around migration. That said, I do think that's actually a really critical lens, and I'm really glad that you voiced that, because I think that begs the question of, in Illinois, what do we need to be, not only what are we currently measuring, but what do we need to be keeping an eye on and or measuring in a new way in order to understand what's happening with these students and understand their experience and understand their needs, right? That's a really important flag, and I think something that we will probably follow up with you on to think about what are the questions that we can navigate as a policy committee together that will help us better understand the needs of those students and meet the needs of those students across our state. Because obviously we know every day many children and families are coming to our state. And if we want them to be successful, which we do, we need to be attuned to those needs. So thank you for bringing that up, Valerie. Okay, so similar to with the secondary measures, our first broad question is, were there any surprises in these post-secondary data that as we reviewed them? Anything that came through as a surprise? Vince, yeah, I see you have your hand raised.
Not really a surprise, just a reflection of Illinois and knowing that the states around us are aggressively dismantling DEI programs in secondary schools and in colleges, and claiming that the systemic racism that exists is over. And our own Supreme Court said the exact same thing. And this is continue to be a call to action in Illinois, that if we can minimize these gaps and aggressively go after that and target interventions in schools, we could really stand out as a hallmark state for a place where this makes a difference. The work actually happens, and that we can show evidence that systemic racism still is happening across our country, even though many of our thought leaders in our country believe that it doesn't.
Yeah, Vince, thank you for voicing that. I appreciate that and share the sentiment 100%. We'll go Mike, then Sam. I see you have your hands raised.
Yeah, the remediation percentages going down in numbers is something we've been looking at the partnership. Obviously, developmental education reform has been one of our biggest priorities as an organization, but that big change happened to the class, I think, the year before that the legislative change happened. If I'm at least if I'm doing these classes.
Yeah, no, the remediation numbers were already starting to go down when transitional math was put into place. Yes.
Well, transitional math, but also the DARA law.
Right.
The DARA law, like, even if you would expect maybe a discontinuity around that, and it does appear there is a discontinuity around the class of 2020, if I'm remembering correctly, that was the year that the DARA Act was being passed. The year after that, it leveled off. Obviously, that's, there's pandemic implications there too. So, there is the Developmental Education Reform Act. So yeah, that's been kind of a question for us that we've been thinking about.
Thank you, Mike. All right, Sam.
Hi, long-time listener, first-time caller. Love this data and the show. My question as I'm looking at this data, which is really great about Illinois. And then I'm sorry, Vince, your question about other states made me think about the topic of Illinois being one of the, if not the largest exporter of our students going to other states. So I wonder if there's any value, again, it's a question thinking out loud with you. Is there any value to look at some of the same data sets, at least from the Georgetown reports, with our circulars, or the states around us, or
Our peers, yeah.
like
That's a good question, Sam. Yeah.
I don't know, something to think about. So not expecting an answer today, but just want to throw that out for this group and the policy committee. And then another thing for this policy committee to be thinking about is the upcoming enrollment cliff, where there are going to be fewer 18-year-old students starting in 2025 going to college or doing anything, because there just won't be enough there won't be as many of them around, whether it's going on to the military or other apprentice jobs, not quote unquote college. So I'm wondering if that's a topic for this group to also start looking at the potential impact of what that enrollment cliff will look like.
Yeah. Sam, I think that's a really, this comes back to the same thing with Valerie, right? Like around like, what can we forecast? What can we anticipate? And I think that enrollment cliff is a really important one. I will note that, and I need to look at it over time, but the MEC dashboard has a very interesting visual about interstate migration, because obviously we hear a lot about students leaving the state. And if I remember correctly, at least a couple of years ago, when you looked at like a heat map of like net out migration, Illinois was middle of the pack. Everyone had roughly the same rates of in and out migration, or net migration, I should say. But I haven't looked at it closely lately, so I'm very thank you for clarifying that. Sam, MEC Midwestern Higher Education Consortium, but that does put us in conversation, and some of these data points in conversation with one another. So something we could consider is pulling some of the visuals from there, where it would put Illinois data next to some of our neighbor states here, for sure, and the nation as a whole. They do a lot of really cool, like top 5 median states overall in the nation, and that kind of thing. Cassie, I see you've got your hand up.
So I love that the community college remediation stuff is coming down. That's so exciting. And I was even at a meeting a few months ago at Wabanzi, and the presenter spoke about, what was the term? Like student self-guided placement, where students decide, after a conversation with an advisor, where they would place themselves in a class. And I think that's so interesting. And I would love to know, like, are the success rates in those classes that students are now placing directly into, are the success rates staying the same? Does that make sense? My guess is they are. My guess is that those students truly are prepared, and that in the past, all those assessment tests place students that were prepared for the work in a lower level class. My guess, but I don't know. I thought it was, and
I think that's a good question, Cassie. I know we heard anecdotally during COVID that there was some setting aside of placement requirements because they couldn't administer.
I heard the same thing, Rock Valley College.
Yeah, and so
and
that they found that those students were fine, right? And so that's not to say that every student is prepared for dual credit. That is not every student is prepared for dual credit, and also there are probably a lot more students who are ready for dual credit than are currently enrolled. So I think it's a great question, and I think one of the things that we may want to try to figure out how to explore with the policy committee would be like, how do we understand the impacts of these different kind of placement policies, and where there might be some ability to think outside the box on this stuff. So I appreciate you raising that. Vince, I see you've got your hand raised. You're still muted.
Yep, you got it. Yep. So I
want to hear you.
I can actually speak to a little bit, and Cassie, thanks for bringing it up. This is a live conversation in school counselor networks, especially in the automatic enrollment and AP courses and upper level courses, and that legislation passed. And again, anecdotally, but I talked to counselors across the state, and school counselors have quite a few anecdotal stories about when students are automatically placed in the upper level courses. They may be academically capable of doing that work, but they haven't been exposed to that level of rigor before. And when there's no support, students struggle. So that continues to be the call for this work, is embedding support in the school so that students can succeed. It's not just a, you're in, make it happen.
Yeah.
There's actually another layer of support that's actually needed.
That's a really good flag, and especially in the context of the fact that all districts are required to have an automatic acceleration policy, right? So I think that's important context around, like, not only do we need to not gatekeep these courses, we also need to be certain that students are being supported to succeed. And that's a really helpful reminder. I think it's something worth digging into as we think about what does it look like to equitably scale early college credit, particularly through dual credit, just because it's a little bit easier to scale than AP might be. Any other reflections on the post-secondary data or the secondary data before we sort of take a step back and think more holistically about the broader conversation? I love this conversation. I love all the comments in the chat as well about sort of disaggregating different metrics that we haven't necessarily been able to look at before. But back to you, Laura.
Yeah, I feel like the conversation is kind of naturally moving. So I feel like some of these wrap-up questions, I'm really curious to hear what people think. So questions that we have kind of look at the whole picture. And I feel like some of the pieces of the conversation might have gone to some of these places, but I think, you know, from the lens of the bigger picture of all the sets of metrics and not necessarily specifically secondary or post-secondary, but the whole pipeline. What metrics did you find the most helpful? What are some policy implications? I said implementations, it says on the slide implications. What are some policy implications of these data? And then are there more data that we should look at with this group? So I feel like we started to definitely get at that last question a little bit, but I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts to share on any of these questions before we wrap up.
So the first set of slides from the secondary perspective, did all of that data come out of the school report cards? So like if we wanted to take a district that's within our EFE and like almost create the same set of slides, but with that district's data, did all of that information come from publicly available Illinois school report card, or or were there like pieces of it that came from stuff that just the Success Network has access to through their relationship with the different state agencies?
Lucy, I'm going to
So,
tap you in on that one.
yeah, all the slides on secondary and post-secondary data came directly from the Illinois report card. So yes, that can be looked at a district or school level.
So we could use your slides as a template.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
And for members of the Success Network, some of these data are available in the dashboard and it's Tableau, so you can kind of play around with it. Not all of these data that we've reviewed are in the dashboard, but we'll talk more about what's coming to the dashboard soon here. But there are some kind of potentially easier ways to download some of these data via the dashboard as well.
Mamusi, which metrics are the ones that are, I know there's more coming up that you're going to talk about in a second. Which ones are the ones that are already on the dashboard?
Yeah, post-secondary enrollment and community college remediation.
Awesome. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Just one real piece that you might find this interesting. So school counseling programs that receive national recognition from American School Counselor Association, they receive RAMP recognition. And part of RAMP is doing a Closing the Gap project, which is where they use all this data. That they have to identify gaps in achievement in some kind of metric. It's a part of that national recognition. Right now, we have about 60 schools in Illinois that have that RAMP recognition. I would love to see 500 on that list and really support them in doing that work. Because as more schools do that, more schools will actually look at this data metric and create those systemic interventions that will hopefully close some of those achievement gaps that we've seen today.
Vince, would you mind just saying the name of that again? The name
Yeah. So American School Counselor Association has a national recognition called RAMP, which is a recognized ASCA model program. And one of the 16 components in the RAMP program is a closing the gap intervention.
Love this. Okay.
Be happy to share more with you about that.
Yeah, I see Edith asked for it in the chat because we definitely would love to pass that along to the broader Success Network for sure.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, should I wrap up? All right, so the next thing before we wrap up that we wanted to just remind everyone about, and it feels crazy, it's like coming up so soon. I feel like I've been talking about it for months. The Success Network Conference is coming up on February 29th. We're going to be at Moraine Valley again this year. So if any of you joined us last year, it's going to be the same place. Edith and the group planning the conference have got a lot of really interesting sessions lined up for you all. So registration for that is open. Edith, I can see already dropped it in the chat. So please feel free to join us for the Success Network Conference. A few other reminders. So our next full meeting of the policy committee, if you, whether you've been on with us before in the policy committee or you haven't and you would like to join us for the first time, we have our open full policy committee meeting. Our first one of 2024 will be March 20th from 9 to 10:30 a.m. You can register for the Zoom through that with the link in the slides. We'll also share it with all the other materials from today's session. And then something else I highlighted here, some of you may be familiar with, others may not, but we have a group, work group within the policy committee that is working to explore transportation related barriers and potential solutions that impact student access to work-based learning. We've done quite a bit of work with this work group so far in the last, 6 months or so. We just put out a memo summarizing their initial findings of the barriers. But one of the things that we're doing next before we wrap up this work is a student survey. So we would love to get some student insight onto transportation access that they have, how they get around, how it relates to their participation in work-based learning. It's not very long, but if you have any students that you work with who are participating or not participating in work-based learning, we've really kind of tried to make a way where both sets of students are able to answer these questions. Please share it with them. We're collecting responses through February 9th, but we would love to get as much student insight as possible. That's a good question, Cassie. Our work group is working with in-school youth, but we actually are collaborating with a work group through the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board that's kind of looking at that other window. So if you have students that would like to provide insight on transportation, I'm sure that that other group would be really interested in, finding out more about what they have to say. And we can connect you with them. Again, just a reminder that we always add at the end of these sessions, but all of our information, like I said, we'll send out follow-up, but also we're going to be posting recordings as well as registration links for our next meeting and our other future meetings that are scheduled all on the Policy Committee tab on the Success Network website. So that's another place. If you don't want to dig through all your emails, you can just go to the Success Network website and it'll be right there. And then Mamusi, one quick shout out for him. So I'll let him take on this slide, but some updates are coming to the Success Network dashboard.
Sure, yeah, coming soon to a city near you is the second phase of the Success Network dashboard with some updated data. 2 metrics that we'll be adding to this next rollout is early college coursework, so AP dual credit, as well as CTE participation and outcomes. So again, some of that more robust CTE data about student experience, demographics, and program outcomes. So excited for that. Be on the lookout. I think we actually have a meeting on the books for next Tuesday with some of our leadership communities in the network. So they'll get the first look at it publicly before it goes out live. So look out for that.
Yeah, just wanted to note that we will be looking at the early college coursework next week, and the CTE data is to come.
And if you're not in a Success Network community, but you may be interested in learning about this, there's, I would say, a high potential that Mamusi will be talking about it in one of our future policy committee meetings down the line. So some really cool work that Mabusi has been doing. Thank you all for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks everyone for the really rich conversation as well.